Hello, welcome to Talking Europe, the show where we discuss some of the topics getting most attention right now in Brussels and beyond. I'm Catherine Nicholson. Now, Europe often goes by the nickname of the old continent. Well, currently, lawmakers, lobbyists and more are working on bringing her more into touch with the world's youngest continent by population age. We're talking about Africa. The two are joined by centuries of history, colonial history, trade, exploitation, also exploration. So where does the relationship stand in 2017? What ambitions do African and European leaders have, and where might they come unstuck? We're joined for today's debate by Cynthia Samuel Olonjuwon from the International Labour Organization. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And you're director of the Africa Regional Office.
Correct.
Perfect for our debate then. We're also joined from the European Parliament by a Socialist MEP Claire Moody, who represents the South West UK constituency. And you also sit on the Committee for Foreign Affairs, among other things.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being with us. Well, we're going to start off actually with some news from Africa that's shocked many people around the world. An undercover report by CNN that revealed evidence of a slave auction of Nigerian men in Libya. This has been a massive talking point, of course, in recent days. So we thought we'd start by watching a report by France 24's newsroom team.
The latest reaction from Antonio Guterres, condemning images which have sparked global outrage.
Good morning. Slavery has no place in our world, and these actions are among the most egregious abuses of human rights and may amount to crimes against humanity.
Guterres' comments come 4 days after the release of this report by US broadcaster CNN, which shows young African men being auctioned off as farm workers in Libya, some going for as little as $400. The video has triggered a wave of protests. Hundreds demonstrated outside the Libyan embassy in Paris this weekend. African leaders, meanwhile, have also expressed outrage. Mali has recalled its ambassador to Libya, and Niger has urged Tripoli to, quote, do everything possible to stop the practice. A call also made by the leader of the African Union.
On behalf of the African Union, I express my outrage at the despicable migrant slave trade taking place in Libya. I firmly condemn this practice from another era.
Libya said on Friday it was opening an investigation into reports of slavery. France, meanwhile, has announced it will take in 25 migrants who were evacuated from Libya to Niger by the UN last week after suffering abuse at the hands of traffickers. It's estimated there are 700,000 to 1 million migrants in Libya.
All right, so we saw in that report there Africans in Paris demonstrating against what's been happening in Libya there. Perhaps if I could come to you first, Claire Moody, what impact can Europe have on a situation like this? Of course, a lot of the migrants who are passing through Libya would ultimately like to reach Europe. Does Europe bear any responsibility?
I don't think the relationship is that kind of linear, if you like, is the way you put it. But actually, firstly, on the human level, clearly the European Union works with with countries in Africa and directly with Libya, and you can't see that report without feeling that you want to take action, you want to stop practices like that. So there's a human response, but also there is a practical response, and making sure that we do take action in to try and stamp out practices like this.
Cynthia Samuel Olonjuwon, if I can come to you off the back of that very shocking story, do you believe that Europe has a responsibility? Libya, we know, is a partner in some senses in the migration story.
I totally agree with the UN Secretary General's statement that such practices as slavery or any type of situation that can be likened onto slavery is unacceptable. And speaking as an ILO official, the ILO has instruments that clearly, indicate that this situation of slavery, forced labor, trafficking are totally unacceptable. And there are clear instruments to guide the work to totally eradicate such practices. Having said that, it's also important for us to situate the event and such practices within the context of global development. Is this not a symptom of a more significant deficit in terms of development interventions in Africa, in countries in Africa? Is that the kind of debate we should be having? Of course, clearly condemning in all totality such practices.
Well, you bring up the issue of development. That's, of course, a focus of the events going on between the EU and Africa at the current time. Now, I know that a main focus of the EU-Africa summit this year is youth, Africa being the youngest continent, as I mentioned. 60% of people in Africa under the age of 25. Claire Moody, if I come back to you, what can Europe do to make a difference to the young people in Africa so that we can try and achieve some of these aims that perhaps Cynthia was talking about before, those long-term aims for Africa?
Yeah, and it is about making sure that youth is an area of concern for European Union work across the piece. We've obviously had youth employment initiatives across the EU itself because of unemployment issues. But yeah, it's really important then when we're working with African administration and investment in Africa, it is about making sure there's long-term, sustainable, quality jobs.
I think to people listening to this, though, perhaps a question that might come up might be, well, why would it be a European responsibility to help with these initiatives? Shouldn't individual African countries be helping their own young people?
Well, we clearly are already working with countries in Africa around developing the economy. It is important. The question that you raised earlier about this linear relationship, which I think you may be reaching towards as well, is this about kind of dealing with the migration problem? Actually, from my perspective, this first and foremost is about doing the right thing about kind of what we value in the European Union is also what we want to see develop in Africa, and that sustainability point. So I think that's the really important factor. And it is something that the Parliament has been pushing for a very long time, is ensuring that there is that qualitative aspect to the work that we're doing with overseas development and beyond just a kind of basic quantitative elements that have been the focus. I
imagine one area that might be of a concern would be how many young Africans could eventually get visas to come and work in Europe in a documented and a fully legalised sense. I imagine that's one of your areas of concern at the International Labour Organization. But, we are seeing pushback on a popular level in Europe against the idea of more migration. Many countries trying to bring down immigration on all fronts.
Thank you very much for that question. But I'd like to just go back to an issue that was raised by Claire, and also linking up to your statement, your introductory statement that Africa is a youthful population. If we look at the current demographics and we look at the projections, by 2045, half of the world youth population will be African. By 2040, the largest labor force will be African. If we want the world to experience sustainable development, then the world has to focus on Africa. So it's not doing it for charity. It's not doing it as an external thing. It's investing in this for the general good. And then when we talk about globalization, we're not talking about just the globalization of products or services. The world is increasingly interconnected. When we talk about the global village, it's real. It's very real. So there is that interest of a global nature to ensure that development is sustainable. Hence, we have the SDG 2030 that talks about leave no one behind.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to link this to the Declaration of Philadelphia by the ILO in 1944, which says poverty anywhere is a threat to prosperity everywhere.
Well, if we, speaking about those broader values that you're bringing up, of course, women's rights are one of the major focuses of, well, not just in the current news agenda, but in terms of development. In Africa, you know, there's a vast picture in terms of the status of women, but they do say, you know, you can judge a society by the status of its women. There are accusations, though, sometimes of cultural interfering, Europe trying to perhaps impose values on African countries or cultures where it's inappropriate. Is this such a thorny issue, or should Europe just be sort of getting on with it and saying, this is what we believe in?
I genuinely, I don't think it's a Eurocentric belief.
No, but we're in Europe, so
51% of the population, where you support women to be able to fulfil their potential, then you're not just supporting them, vital though that is, and an end in itself. You're also supporting their families. You're developing the economy. It is, women. As I say, women are the majority of the population. We also have a fundamental role to play in the society around us as well.
But that's not necessarily a prevailing view everywhere around the world. If we look at some of the very much more liberal social democrat countries of Europe, for example, sort of your Swedens and Finlands, the status and rights of women there can be very different from even other parts of the European Union. So how does that translate when we're trying to talk about women's rights in a whole other continent?
Yes, to me, perhaps this is a fundamental value, and it is about ensuring that women have equal rights and are treated equally. And frankly, and we're not perfect, we're certainly not perfect, we're not perfect in any country, even the Scandinavian ones you talked about, but across Europe, but it is something that I think we pursue continually.
Cynthia, if you want to come back on that point.
Yeah, I totally agree with the comments made in terms of the universality of these rights. And also, when you look at the international instruments, for example, that are supposed to have universal applicability, these are enshrined, whether it's the ILO standards relating to the equality of women and men at work, whether it's even the SDGs that clearly promote interventions across the board, irrespective of cultural values, across the board, to ensure that women and men are provided with the necessary opportunity to be able to self-actualize and to contribute to development. And if I take the case specifically of Africa, when we look at some of the policy documents that have come out of the African Union, not only is this recognized as a key right to be promoted, but interventions have been put in place to ensure that that is done, particularly within the realm of decent work. And that goes to the quality of work that was talked about earlier. I'll give two examples. The first one is the AU Agenda 2063, which seeks to position Africa to be a key player in the global arena and a continent in peace with itself, and able to ensure that its citizens maximize the opportunities of development and also contribute. That's one. The key outcome areas on gender equality. But when we look at the 10-year plan of the African Union, adopted by the heads of state in 2015 to promote employment, poverty eradication, and inclusive development, one of the key priorities there is promoting employment for women and young people. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much to both my guests, Cynthia Samuel Olonjuwon from the International Labour Organisation, also to MEP Claire Moody. Thanks both for being with us. And just before we leave you, what's been happening in fake news lately, I hear you ask? It is time for our checkup in Fact or Fake.
Is Madrid staging a coup d'etat in Catalonia? This is what the deposed Catalan leader Carles Puigdemont has stated earlier this month, slamming the European Union for backing what he described as a coup d'etat by Madrid following the independence referendum in Catalonia. Referring to the suspension of Catalonia's self-rule, Mr. Puigdemont called on the EU and Spanish authorities to accept the results of the referendum, which saw 92% of voters backing independence from Spain. But the deposed Catalan leader did not mention some crucial detail. First, only 43% of registered voters took part in the referendum, and there was no minimum participation required to validate it. International observers, in fact, did not recognize the outcome of the vote, undermining its legitimacy. By organizing a referendum on independence, Mr. Puigdemont also claims to carry the will of a majority of the Catalan people who elected him in 2015. This is, in fact, highly questionable. When regional elections took place 2 years ago, 52% of voters actually backed parties which were against independence from Spain. It is only thanks to alliances that secessionist parties managed to clinch a short majority in the Catalan parliament. In such a context, accusing Madrid of staging a coup in Catalonia seems far-fetched at the very least. In fact, if anyone actually attempted to stage a coup d'etat in Spain, it is probably Mr. Puigdemont himself.
Well, that's it for today's show. Thanks very much again to our guests here on Talking Europe today. Thanks to you for watching as well. Do stay tuned to France 24. More European news and discussion coming up after the headlines in part 2.